All right, so let's do Roman numeral 3, ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. So what are ventricles? Ventricles are spaces. They are hollow areas of our brain that you can see in blue here. So we have 4 total, and they are all connected to each other. So let's find all 4. So we have 2 large ventricles, so follow the cursor, that look like, I don't know, little claws. So this one here is called a lateral ventricle. We have one in each hemisphere. So there's a lateral ventricle in the right hemisphere, a second lateral ventricle in the left hemisphere. So those are 2 lateral ventricles. Those are the largest, and they have projections into all the lobes of the brain. So they're going to have a occipital or posterior horn. They're going to have these inferior or lateral horns. They're going to have an anterior horn going into the frontal lobe. So if we look, these 2 lateral ventricles have a little connection point to this region here, which is called the third ventricle. The third ventricle is going to have a connection, a narrow connection, down into the fourth ventricle. So this connection you do need to know. This is called the aqueduct of the midbrain, also known as the cerebral aqueduct. The word aqueduct is what's common there. And then we have a fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle is going to then narrow and become something called the central canal, which runs all the way through our spinal cord. So let's go back to our lateral ventricles for a second and talk about the bolded word, which is the septum pellucidum. So the 2 lateral ventricles, they are in different hemispheres, but there's a sheet of connective tissue that separates them. So if we want to look at the view this way, here are our 2 lateral ventricles. This is our third ventricle. This is the narrow aqueduct, and this is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle narrows and becomes the central canal. Let's find the septum pellucidum. So in this view, we took a frontal section of the brain, and those spaces, again, those are our 2 lateral ventricles. And then here we have that sheet of connective tissue that hangs down and separates the 2 lateral ventricles. So this is what's called the septum pellucidum. In class, if we were going to dissect a sheep brain in your hands, you would be able to see this. If you are doing an online version, as we are this semester, then we are going to watch a video of someone dissecting a sheep brain. But this is a structure that you should be able to see. Okay, so there's our septum pellucidum. All right, so let's look at our what is it that actually creates the cerebrospinal fluid. So what I'm going to do is have you guys go up to number 2. We're still under letter A, ventricles. Number 2 says each ventricle contains a choroid plexus, which produces the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, the choroid plexus is a bed of capillaries wrapped in ependymal cells. As plasma leaves the bloodstream, it gets modified and by these ependymal cells to form the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so let's look at what's going on here. So this is our capillary, this is our blood vessel, and it's lined with these specialized glial cells called ependymal cells. So these ependymal cells, we're going to talk about these again in chapter 13, and these cells are going to be modifying the plasma. So you see the arrow coming away. So the watery plasma that's in the blood, as it leaks out of that bloodstream, it will get modified by adding nutrients, vitamins, oxygen, ions, and creating what is known as cerebrospinal fluid. This choroid plexus also acts as a sort of waste removal method, right? So we can get the metabolic wastes back into the bloodstream this way as well. But together, right, this unit is called the choroid plexus, as you see here. So where do you find the choroid plexus? There's 4 of them, one inside of each ventricle. Each ventricle is cranking out cerebrospinal fluid every day. So where is cerebrospinal fluid made? It's made inside your ventricles of the brain. The 4 ventricles each make cerebrospinal fluid, nowhere else, okay? So you are constantly making cerebrospinal fluid because it leaks away from your bloodstream, and you are constantly need to drain the cerebrospinal fluid. So remember we talked about the arachnoid granulations in the subarachnoid space that allows that cerebrospinal fluid to drain. That's one route out. So let's take a look at that, right? So this is a look at, so let's look at letter B. Let's look at letter B, cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid transports nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste. It's created by each ventricle by the choroid plexus. It provides buoyancy for the brain. So what that means is, notice how the area around the brain, right, so this blue area, and the arrows are sort of telling you the circulation pattern of the cerebrospinal fluid. So we can see the cerebrospinal fluid coming away from your ventricles of the brain. It comes into that subarachnoid space, and it fills the subarachnoid space and cushions the brain all around it. So it kind of cut away the inferior portion, but we have an inferior portion that also has cerebrospinal fluid. We can also see the cerebrospinal fluid can drain down around the spinal cord. Okay, so and then here is the mechanism to come back into the bloodstream, right, through those arachnoid granulations. So let's go back and talk about, like, why does it provide buoyancy for the brain? Because your brain is floating on a 2 millimeters worth of cerebrospinal fluid. So instead of having a 3-pound mushy organ resting on a hard surface, resting on your skull, and if you imagine a 3-pound block of tofu, it's going to crush, right? Just the weight of the organ itself will crush the underside of that organ. But since your brain is literally floating on a little skim of cerebrospinal fluid, it's floating, and so it doesn't weigh as much practically. So that's what buoyancy means. It's being floated, and it takes that actual weight of the brain to 0.11 pounds. So it's a nice way of protecting the brain and cushioning the brain and relieving the brain of really being crushed by its own weight. All right, so we have cushioning and protection, number 4. And then number 5, it's resorbed back into the bloodstream via those arachnoid granulations, or at the end of the spinal cord. Okay, so I have this GIF for you, which is nice because it can show you that every time your heart beats, right, since the cerebrospinal fluid does arise from the capillary beds, it's under the same sort of pumping mechanism or circulation mechanism as your blood. So it has this pulse to it. So you can see the pulsation patterns within the GIF. We have a lot of movement here where we have our ventricles, the lateral third ventricle. We have a lot of movement here, which is our subarachnoid space. All right, our condition here is hydrocephalus. So if you find hydrocephalus in this region of your outline, it's literally translates to water on the brain, but it's not water. This is cerebrospinal fluid that is not draining properly. So there's different channels of draining cerebrospinal fluid other than those arachnoid granulations. And unfortunately, there are times when it doesn't drain properly, and you get in an infant this expanded skull. So I'm going to answer this question: how is this condition different in an adult versus an infant? And you might already know, right? An infant, their skull has not fully fused yet, so the bones are separated still by fontanelles, and allows the infant's brain or skull, to be malleable. So if there is swelling and buildup of fluid in the brain, the skull can actually accommodate that swelling and become larger and larger, which is what you see here. In the adult, however, the adult does not have a skull that's malleable. A skull is fused, and so the swelling in the brain would just crush the brain itself, because there's nowhere for that extra pressure or fluid to go. So it's just going to compress the brain, which is more dangerous in the adult. Okay, so the overall protection to our brain is going to be our skull, our blood-brain barrier. So this is going to be mentioned in chapter 13, the meninges, and our cerebrospinal fluid.